Alright, welcome to our Unit 3 review over languages. So the basic graphic illustration of languages that we need to know is the language tree. Keep in mind the language tree can be very complicated, but if you remember kind of what's the biggest to the smallest, it'll be a little bit easier. And if you think about English as the example, or Indo-European, it'll be a little bit easier for us to kind of look at. So language family, this is a collection of groups that were together before kind of written history or recorded history. So we know Indo-European goes back a long ways. This is going to be a language family. Notice how many different languages and the large number of people that are with the language family. Now a language branch is where it's going to break off a little bit. You got the Germanic branch, Romance branch, Balto-Slavic, okay, and the Sino-Tibetan branch that we kind of know for Indo-European. A group is going to be a little bit smaller in there. You have West Germanic could be a group, North Germanic could be a group, so it's something that's broken off a little bit. Remember, again, branches are the ones that are used the least amount when we really talk about the language tree. The language itself is going to be the final, the leaf, if you will, the smallest amount of people who are going to speak something on kind of the language tree itself. All right. Keep in mind the biggest languages in the world. You got English, you got Spanish, okay, and then you have Mandarin, as well as kind of like a really big prominent languages in the world. So language terms we need to kind of know going over. Official language, it's the language done by governments. Keep in mind they want to have an official language because it makes it much easier to understand laws. It's cheaper. It brings kind of people together. They believe it brings people together if they all speak the same language. You can get over cultural barriers. It's easier to do business if you have an official language. Right? Not every country has one official language. Some have kind of bilingual or multilingual countries. Remember, multilingual could refer to a country that has many languages, but it could also refer to a country that has multiple official languages as well. Keep in mind, a lot of countries in Africa are multilingual or bilingual when it comes to official languages. A lot of them have French or English as a secondary or as an official language. Not that many people use it as their primary language, but they have as an official language kind of as a long-lasting impact of colonization over the last 150 to 200 years from Europe to Africa. Now remember, literary tradition is basically any kind of visual written down form of the language, whether it be phonical sounds or when you start talking about logograms. All right, remember logograms are just the images that represent words. So when you see the image, that image does not make a sound. That image is a memorization of a represented word. Whereas most languages in the world have more of a phonic alphabet where kind of that symbol, whatever symbol you draw, has a certain sound to it. Okay, so in English we'll do Scholzi for an S there, so S has a kind of sound to it. Alright, whereas a logogram, where if you see this image, it just means friendship. You can't sound this out, you just have to know that it's friendship. Now, language families, these are just ones you geographically need to kind of know where they are. Indo-European, this is going to be the one that most massively spread out through the world. North America, South America, Europe, it's predominant. And the tricky one here is going to be India as well. So North America, South America, Europe, and India. If you keep that in mind, Indo-European, India, and European type countries, alright, or European influences where you're going to find it predominant. Keep in mind this is going to be French, Spanish, and English are going to be the main ones for this. Now the Sino-Tibetan. Sino might be a little bit hard, but if you know that Tibet is a part of China, you start thinking of Chinese region, China region. Now the most prominent one is going to be Mandarin version of the Chinese language. That is going to be the most prominent. It's the biggest language in the entire world. Right? Remember, the Indo-European is the biggest family, but the biggest language itself, the biggest leaf, is going to be the Mandarin leaf. Remember, this is the only branch, this is the only family that has the logograms. When you get to Japonic, they don't use logograms. It looks very similar, but they sound those out. Keep in mind, China again looks at this as more of a prideful type thing, that most of their country speaks one language. It's more of a unifying factor for them. Now, when we start looking at Austronesian, keep in mind Austronesian, think about Australia type area, except it's not really Australia, and think about more of the Polynesian, Micronesia type area or region of the world. question you might receive sometime in the future, may not be for me, but how does this language kind of get to Madagascar? All right, obviously this is going to be through relocation diffusion, because you can't really have contagious diffusion when you have an entire Indian Ocean in between. A lot of these Austronesian ones, kind of the thing about it that we need to know, or kind of the kind of characteristic, is a lot of these different islands, because they are isolated, because they are islands, all have different languages throughout. Not every single one, but a lot of these different places have different languages, mainly because of isolation for hundreds of years away from each other. Keep in mind, islands and kind of mountains and physical barriers kind of do that, where they keep languages separated, keep them isolated, and kind of start breaking apart languages. Japonic, keep in mind, Japanese, pretty simple. Note that Japanese use phonics, they do not use logograms. Now, the two in Africa, you have the Afro-Asiatic. So if you think about Africa and parts of Asia, this is actually Southwest Asia. You want to start thinking about this as a region. All right, what do we know about this region? Okay, it's Islamic region, it's a Muslim region. Oh, they probably speak Arabic. So understand that Arabic is going to be a main language for the Afro-Asiatic. Niger, Congo, this is where we have the idea of a very, very wide range of languages spoken. So Niger, Congo, think about where those two countries are located, more sub-Saharan Africa. So that's where this family is going to be. So now keep in mind, how do the Indo-European family diffuse? Now, we don't need to know all of them, but this is kind of a big one, because this is kind of where our language, English, kind of derived. All right, so before we get going on this part, one clarification. This is kind of the original backstory of English, but this is not exactly where English came from. All right, these people never spoke English. We didn't have English until it got to, all right, England itself. That's where English evolves. But this is how the whole Indo-European family got to Europe, got to India, was through these two hypotheses. The first one is the nomadic warrior hypothesis by Maria Gimbutas, and this is the one, when you think about the G, think about giddy up. This is going to be the horses. All right, what do they need to do with the horses? Well, they're really good at the horses, so they're going to go to war a lot, mainly to capture a lot of different lands so that they can continue to raise their horses. This spreads basically from modern day Kazakhstan, kind of the steppe of Russia, if you will, and it slowly spreads this way, which will eventually get to India, and then this part is what's going to lead us kind of to Europe and our modern day languages today. The opposing theory is the peace one. Keep in mind, the warrior one is kind of the war hypothesis. This is the peace one, where you have the Anatolians, who then maybe 2,000 years prior went up to where Kazakhstan was, which may have led to the Kyrgyz, but then spreads to India and the rest of Europe. Now, again, this was spread mainly for the reason of farming. All right, once you say one farming practice to somebody next to you and they pass it on, you can kind of see how languages spread across. If you're successful at farming, people are going to want to know how you farmed. All right, and they're going to have to learn your language in order to kind of get that idea. So this is the Colin Renfrew. All right, there's nothing associated kind of with the R on this one as there is with the Gumbudas one with giddy up. Now, keep in mind, either way, it doesn't matter which hypothesis is correct. All right, now we need to kind of know how these languages ended up isolated from each other. So our first branch, we have Indo-European branch, we have Indo-Iranian. So think more about India for this branch. So Indo-European, the next part is the branch. Indo, think more India. The main factor here is going to be Hindi is going to be the biggest language or the biggest leaf here. Moving on with the Romance branch. So keep in mind, the Romance branch has nothing to do with love. It has more to do with Rome as kind of being the Roman Empire. When Rome had this entire region kind of all to themselves, they were conquering it. They had soldiers stationed kind of throughout, and the soldiers had to spread Latin throughout as well. But because they were isolated for so many years, separated from each other, they came up with this kind of idea of vulgar Latin. This is kind of a broken down version, of Latin. So all these different places kind of had their own little different version of Latin as the Roman Empire kind of took over everything. Once the Roman Empire fell, all right, kind of their native language mixed in with Latin, this is kind of why they're kind of related here a little bit, is that once they started breaking down Roman Empire started having all these places kind of get their own independence. They start having all of their own languages throughout. You start having French, you start having Portuguese, you start having Spain, which are all kind of Latin based or Latin influence, mainly because of the Latin language that was spread out throughout the Roman Empire. Again, this idea of vulgar Latin, these kind of simplified versions of Latin throughout the empire. The next branch, the Balto Slavic. This is probably the one that's a little bit trickier. Just know that Russia or Russian is the main player in this. The Soviet Union used to encompass all of this region here, and they made everybody speak Russian at that time. Once the Soviet Union fell apart, a lot of these smaller countries started going back to their native language, the language that they preferred to speak, which could be um, Armenian, Albanian, etc., Romanian, all throughout kind of their native languages. So moving on to the final one of Germanic. Germanic is going to be where we get English from, but also think about German. All right, think about this is kind of the more north and west part of Europe. So you're going to have Scandinavian languages, you're going to have German, and you're going to have English. And we'll talk here a little about how English kind of breaks away. So the story of English, how English kind of broke away from all these other languages, kind of the Germanic branch, if you will. Keep in mind the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes invaded England years ago. They mix in with the native kind of language, but notice exactly kind of where they go. Based on where they go, this is why we're going to have different versions of English in England, why you're going to start getting those different dialects because of the different tribes that started to settle in different parts of England. This culture began to be known as Anglo-Saxon culture. But now we have the Anglo-Saxon culture, but now we have kind of the invasion of the Vikings, the Normans from France, so you're going to have a little bit of a French influence into the English language. So you have the Jutes, the Saxons come in and they invade, they start blending in with the native indigenous languages. Years later, now you have the Normans from France, which bring French there, and the Vikings from Norway. They start embedding their language into that language, and now we start having what we know today is now English. So remember, dialects is not a separate language, even though some people could argue that it is a different language. So when you start looking at Portuguese, or looking at Spanish. But these are regional variations of a language. Because you live in this part of the country, you're going to start saying words like this way, y'all, you, etc. And in addition to it, you might have kind of a different accent, which kind of embeds this as well. For the most part, this is done usually through relocation and fusion. The reason we have different dialects in the United States is because we had different settlers in different spots of the United States. So when they learn English, they all learned it differently. England has different versions of English, mainly because of all those different tribes that came years and years and years ago, settled at different spots in the country before they started learning all the same language. Now, this kind of imaginary boundary, this is not a cut and dry boundary, but this imaginary boundary is going to be called an isogloss. The people to the north are going to say you or you guys. People to the south of this line are going to start saying you all. Now, dialects in English, you have the RP or the received pronunciation. This is kind of the posh type thing. A lot of sportscasters, excuse me, actors, actresses, the royal family, they will then start speaking in this kind of language or dialect. It's very clear, you can hear the pronunciation. Cockney, again, this is going to be kind of the working class, the rough part of East London, other parts of England that are not as kind of royal or uppity, if you will. And this is the accent that it's eventually going to influence the Australian accent. So a lot of these people are the ones you can kind of assume then that then migrated to Australia. Now, dialects in the United States. We don't need to know about all the different dialects, but if you need to know these kind of three main ones. The northern ones are going to be more of the people of that RP pronunciation. The people in the south are going to be the more lower class of England that came to the United States. They're going to be the ones that kind of had that Cockney background. The main difference is this: the middle part of the country, which spreads out through most of the U.S., including Wisconsin, is these are all different ethnic groups that migrated to the United States, other than English people. Here you're going to have a lot of Germans here, you're going to have a lot of Irish here, you're going to have a lot of Italians here, and they blend together to come up with their kind of own background of or dialect of English. Now, as you can see from the book, this spreads into many, many different dialects throughout the country, but these are the three main ones you kind of need to know. Basically, who came where in the United States and started creating these different dialects. So comparing and contrasting British versus American English, keep in mind this is done three different ways. Vocabulary sets us apart, okay? Spelling and pronunciation. Vocabulary meaning we have different words than people in Britain because when we were here, we encountered new ideas, new inventions that were separate from Britain. Therefore, we had to come up with our own terms for them. Spelling, this is more of an identification difference. We want to spell our words this way because after independence we wanted to separate ourselves from the British Empire. And pronunciation, this is more to do with isolation and with reading all this stuff through just print media. All right, how do you pronounce something? Usually you understand that by hearing people. Since we're not hearing people in the British Empire because they're not here any longer, all right, we started saying the words differently, kind of in our own way. So now looking at the global domination, or dominance, I should say, of English, keep in mind this all starts with the idea of a lingua franca. You can have many lingua francas in the world. You can have a lingua franca of a region. You have Swahili in sub-Saharan Africa. The world lingua franca would be, at this time, would be English. It used to be French. During the Soviet Union, when they had many different kind of countries under their control, Russia was a lingua franca for them because Russia was kind of the expected language that all these different people would have to know in order to kind of do business and communicate with each other throughout the Soviet Union. So remember, a lingua franca usually used for international communication for trade, but the reason you need this lingua franca is for people who have different native languages. Okay, otherwise they will not be able to understand each other. Remember, again, it used to be French, and now it's English as kind of lingua franca. This is usually done through migration and conquest, previously of the French Empire, now of more of the British Empire. So think about where the British kind of went here. Kind of go back to those slides there a little bit. They colonized Canada, United States, Sub-Saharan Africa. They colonized India for a bit, and Australia. Thus, they're going to help diffuse English to those places because they need to do business there. And now, since many of these people already know English, all right, now today that's going to be kind of one of the historical reasons of why English is today is the world lingua franca. If you think about all the people and all the power here, you got the UK, United States, Canada, that's a lot of power, that's a lot of people. Sub-Saharan Africa, really not as much powerful. India, you could say, is economically a little bit powerful because of the resources they provide. And same thing with Australia. Now think about today, popular culture. A lot of media is done through English. People want to learn these English language so they can understand the pop culture a little bit better. It has a little bit more of a quote cool aspect to it. And even today, airline pilots continue to use English as the language of communication. Keep in mind, if they did not have the same vocabulary, same language to use between all these different traffic controllers, you have people from different country, that could get very confusing. Again, a contemporary reason is going to be the domination of Wall Street in the United States, and also at the same time, Hollywood, talking about mass media, talking about movies, television shows that are all done in English, and people kind of want to understand that, so they're going to learn English as that language. So keep in mind French in North America, predominantly the region of Canada, the southeast region of Canada, the eastern region of Canada, is going to be Quebec. That is a province of Canada. Keep in mind they're very prideful when they talk about their French heritage. These people are known as francophones. Anybody who speaks French kind of outside of France are known as francophones. This was once conquered by the Brits, all right, but the French later took over. Now this is a dominant area, whereas the rest of Canada is all English-based, British Empire-based. All right, obviously their own country today, but they're going to speak English on this part of the country, and it's going to be French over here. Now, ways they've preserved this, made mandatory activities done in French, okay, in the Quebec region, changed toponyms. They've literally changed a lot of toponyms to be more French-based toponyms. Something as even simple as changing stop signs from the English word into the French word. All these kind of government policies are one way to help preserve a language in a region. Now, what threatens it? If you think about diverse neighborhoods, a lot of migrants who are coming in, speaking their native language, that is going to threaten the kind of loss of French in that area. And then keep in mind, a lot of these migrants who come in know that English is their best shot economically at getting jobs. So therefore, they're not even going to convert to French as kind of the language of the area. They're going to convert to English as kind of the language, which is going to bypass French. And then in addition, think about like marriage, how marriage can eventually, you have a person who speaks English marrying a person that speaks French, okay, depending on where they live, where they move to. All right, that's one way that you can start losing French in Quebec. So moving on to the idea of pidgin language, keep in mind pidgin language is not a kind of a very formal language. They don't have a lot of grammar rules to it. It's basically a simplified version of mixing of languages in order for people just to communicate daily from one language to another. So it's just a simplified mix. A lot less grammar is kind of involved for this. This is never anybody's first language. This is like a secondary language people use to communicate. Idea behind this is kind of like Spanglish in Miami, especially with a lot of Cuban migrants, and Swahili in Eastern Africa. Swahili is a real language. It's also used as a lingua franca in that area. It's not a first language. Again, that would be a secondary language. So Swahili is probably one of the more formal of the pidgin languages, even though most pidgin languages are not formal. Not really the opposite, but very related to this is a Creole language. Keep in mind, Creole languages are usually more island or coastal ones because it was much kind of harder for them to keep control of those colonies that were all kind of scattered out. But basically, it's the native language embedded with the colonized language. Okay, they didn't fully convert to the colonized language. They kept using a little bit of their indigenous language mixed in with the colonizer. So one could say this is a little bit more of force, even though they had some resistance because they're still speaking their own language. Whereas Pidgin is going to be more definitely voluntary. The most prominent Creole language we need to kind of understand is Haiti French or Haitian French. And then Louisiana, this has kind of embedded a lot of French culture into southern Louisiana when the French came and kind of conquered or colonized that area. Now onto multilingual states. Keep in mind there's a lot of good reasons why you'd want to have multilingual states, and then also think about like a lot of negatives multilingual states can have. In Belgium, you have two parts. You have the north, you have the Flanders, okay, who are going to speak Flemish, and then you're going to have Wallona in the south, which is going to be more French speaking. Easiest way to understand that is if you know where Belgium is, which you probably should, is that the French speaking part is going to be more towards France. Keep in mind this area does not really get along too much. It's a very separatist view in Belgium, where the northern part is not very fond of the southern part because they feel they kind of carry the southern part, especially economically. The capital of Brussels, though, is officially bilingual, so the north is one language, the south is another language, but if you go to Brussels, you need one reason to kind of keep the peace there is going to be to kind of keep it bilingual there. So just keep in mind this is kind of a source of a lot of tension. Language is a source of big tension in Belgium. On the other end of it, if you look at the other part, or the other end of France, you have Switzerland here. This is again is another more developed country, which has been pretty stable at being a multilingual country. The reason they do this is they kind of grant everybody their own official language there. You have German, French, and Italian. All right, and you also have in their own distinct areas, they basically let all these separate little areas, okay, in Switzerland say, hey, do what you guys need to do in order to kind of keep the peace. If you want to speak German in this area, let's speak German. If you want French to be in this area, you can you can speak French. Again, all these decisions are made at the local level, and that's to try to keep many people there who are different happy by letting them have kind of their own local decision. Now, Nigeria would be an example of a developing country that has a variety of different languages spoken. This is usually because of the ethnic background or the ethnic makeup of Nigeria, which is extremely, extremely diverse. Keep in mind the largest three of those languages only represent an eighth of the speakers, and you have roughly a quarter of a billion people there who speak over 500 different languages. So Nigeria is a very, very fractured country when you start talking about languages because of all the different ethnic groups in Nigeria. Now our final multilingual state is technically going to be Spain, but the region we're looking at here is Catalonia. Keep in mind they have a recent kind of referendum to try to declare independence from Spain. Being one of the reasons being is because of the language Catalonia, the language they speak. They feel kind of separates them from the rest of Spain. It's definitely used as a major source of identity. Again, keep in mind people identify a lot with their languages, but because of this identification, many Catalans want to have independence from the rest of Spain. Alright, so now moving on to kind of isolated languages that are unrelated to any other family or language. One that we have is Basque. Basque is very similar to Catalonia in that they want to have a lot of independence or self-identification, mainly because they feel they are much different than the rest of Spain. And one reason that they are is because of the language of Basque that they do speak. This language was there before the Kyrgyz came, before the Anatolians came, whoever came. This language predates Indo-European. The reason they were able to separate this for years and be separate and isolated, if you will, is because of the Pyrenees Mountains. It was so difficult for people to kind of get over these mountains. It was a huge physical barrier. The only real way you could kind of get there was through kind of the ocean way. People weren't really kind of doing that. So therefore today the Basque language is very unrelated to Spain, very unrelated to Portuguese, very unrelated to French, as these three languages are very much related to one another. Final language is going to be Icelandic. Keep in mind, Iceland is very much isolated from the rest of Europe, all right, unless you had relocation diffusion and a lot of different immigration. This language has not changed for quite a long time, but it's the least change of the Germanic language, or one of the original languages that came from kind of the Kyrgyz, Anatolians, etc. Once it got to Iceland, they started developing their own language, and they kind of kept theirs separate from the rest of Europe because they had very, very few visitors from the rest of Europe. Now, moving on to extinct languages. Keep in mind, extinct languages are no longer spoken by anybody as a first language. You might still know the language, and we might know the language, but extinct means there's no native speakers. A couple of good examples of this is in North America, you have a lot of Native Americans languages who have went extinct over the years, and then Gothic. Gothic went away with the Roman Empire, kind of when Christianity took over. They spread Latin throughout that area. Gothic is one of those languages that died when the Roman Empire kind of expanded. Now, an example of a revived language is Hebrew, the language of the Jewish people. This language was kind of gone for 2,000 years, as with the diaspora of the Jewish people around the world, they no longer had kind of that common Hebrew language anymore. They kind of took up the language of the local population to speak. But in the 19th century, this was revived, and now today you have a lot of native people who grew up learning Hebrew, either as a predominant first language or as a secondary language to help practice their religion. Now, different ways that people preserve local languages. This was in the textbook over about 2 to 3 pages about the Celtic branch. Remember when the Celtic branch kind of starts dying out here, all these different ways they're now trying to preserve their different Celtic language to try to preserve it and keep this language going for years and years to come. One way they do try to preserve it is through schools, having set up special government schools that help promote this language, teach this language. Road signs is a very simple way government kind of institutes ways to kind of preserve the language. Local government utilities are all done in this preserving language, as opposed to the main language that might be spoken in the area. And then also TV stations, and then banning of British signs. So not only can you promote your own sign, you can come down here and start banning English signs, so that your language is the only language that's being posted up there on signs.